produces the book, markets the book, and distributes the book.
Big City College.
So I guess we want to start out by talking about like how we started working together, talking about the mothership connection, or the mother box connection, excuse me, not the mothership connection, but the mother box connection. The work that we've been doing with Black Kirby, just to kind of like do an overview, like Black Kirby is the collaborative entity that Stacey Robinson and I have started to kind of like just deal with some of these issues around, using the comics medium as a way to kind of like deal with some of these issues around representation and social justice and storytelling. So, but I'll let Stacey kick off like just some of the things that we, as far as like how we start working together, and then we'll just kind of go through the talk and look at some of Jack Kirby's influences and just some of the works and some of the comparisons of stuff between his work and some of the things we're trying to do with it. So.
How we started, well, we met in 2006
right.
at ECBAC, East Coast Black Age and Comics Convention, seated next to each other, and I fronted on a project that he told me. This is what made us actually start working together. He told me to send him some work for a project a catalog that he was putting together, and I was like, okay. It probably won't happen, so I won't worry about it. And it published. And it published, and I said, oh, wow, so he must have gotten some of my work. And I looked through it several times, there was no work in there. So to this day, that's what made me remember, if John says he's going to do something, it's going to happen. So a few years later, we met at another convention, and here, actually, OnyxCon, the first OnyxCon.
One of the first.
Okay, and for some reason, seating was not, it did not work out, and we got placed together like in the back somewhere. On a stage, right. And but it allowed, what happened was, it was a blessing because it allowed us to talk and politic all day. Like that's what we did all day. So from there we talked about a lot of ideas, realized that we had a lot in common, and decided to eventually work together on some stuff. And since then, we've just been tiering projects and working on things. I think this is our first major collaboration. And we were talking about Jack Kirby. We were talking about what happened to him after he died, and some of the things that are arguable about proceeds and residuals, things of that nature, that should have been awarded to him, arguably. But we decided to actually comment on that and combine that with the idea of his mythos and counter, because that's what we do as Black creators. We counter the movement that's already been established. So we actually decided to make work that actually dealt with all these layers of issues.
So, let me kind of get started. Like, I'm assuming that most people know who Jack Kirby, and show of hands who know who Jack Kirby was. Pretty like,
Jack
relatively
superhero show.
You know who Stan Lee was?
Yeah.
Sorry, he's still here. Okay. Right. Anyway, so Jack Kirby, born Jakob Kurtzberg, is probably one of the most like prolific comics creators in the history of the medium, and actually co-created Captain America, the Avengers, the X-Men, a lot of the Hulk actually too, a lot of the really popular Marvel comics that are getting a lot of shine now in films. As you look at like the new Iron Man 3 movie that just came out, for instance, he co-created Iron Man, right? And he was kind of the silent partner of Stan Lee. So Stan Lee actually, or born Stanley Lieber, right, is he's a writer, creator. He's also kind of the front man, the voice of Marvel Comics for many years. And in his lifetime, Jack Kirby drew about 25,000 pages of comics and created genres. For instance, he created the romance genre, and actually probably like co-created the whole like horror anthology genre as well. The first one that he worked on was called Black Magic, and actually had a black romance comic that he wanted to do that actually never really got off the ground. But anyway, he was very inventive, and as Stacey was talking about, created his own mythopoetic as far as like how he dealt with like just restructuring mythology and stuff. And a lot of the the work that he did has influenced a lot of like the Black Age of comics creators, you know. And I've heard people talk about his work, you know, as far as like the Incredible Hulk. And the first thing I ever tried to draw was Thor, you know, because I used to read like a lot of Norse mythology. And so to see like, you know, my mom bought me like the Mighty Thor when I was a kid, and I was like, wow, this is pretty good. It's like just this is Norse mythology, but kind of cooler, you know. You know, what's going on with this? You know, so that's kind of like how we first saw his work. And at first, you know, as a kid, and I think probably Stacey would echo this too, I didn't really like his work. You know, I was used to like the, you know, George Tuska or like the John Burns work, or you know, Terry Austin's work, or even like Neil Adams' work. There's like a lot more, you know, realistic, you know, quote unquote realistic as far as like comics go. And so Jack Kirby's really bold forms that kind of broke outside the space and actually kind of abstracted the human form even more. Didn't realize that we were looking at pretty much like a modern artist working in the comics medium, right? And so that's kind of like what the show is looking at to a certain degree, some of these pieces. But yeah, this is just some of the characters. It's great, the Silver Surfer. I mean, it's just the list goes on and on, right? Of course, you know, Kirby co-created the Black Panther as well with Stan Lee, and like 4 months before the organization that would be called the Black Panther Party, like actually called itself that, right? So some of the things that we were looking at were kind of making those kind of like implications a lot more explicit, those connections a lot more explicit. Like, oh, you know, so it was kind of like, what if Jack Kirby was, you know, this brother, you know, this black creator, what would he be creating, you know, through kind of like an Afrocentric lens? What are some of the worlds that would be like made, you know? And so we're thinking about, again, like he was always concerned, it seems, with various types of mythologies, right? Like this notion of the sublime, you know, that would come out in some of the more ethereal work that he would do. Like so he looked at gods and goddesses quite a bit, but also he was very interested in like different types of like modern art movements. And he was a collage artist also, which I thought a lot of people don't realize. He actually did like a lot of really beautiful collage work. Was highly influenced by like modern art, pop art. And this is actually from a series that he did called it's called The Faces of God. You know, it's like just he was trying to draw God, you know, try to draw like entities, you know, that represented, you know, these connections to, you know, to like different types of like power structures outside of ourselves. And there's this really great book called Hand of Fire that just came out last year, and it looks at like one particular chapter that affected me was this chapter called Sublime Technology. So, because Kirby would do like these crazy, like intricate, like, you know, pieces of technology that did these like really like simple functions. You know, almost like Rube Goldberg machines to some degree. You know, if you've seen his work, but it was like just do all this crazy contributive cause and effect things. Actually, you know, stir some coffee or something. You know? But you know, there were these massive structures, and so he was just making up worlds. And actually, he created some of the conventions of how we would think about, you know, creating characters, you know, or the superhero, and for good or ill, you know, he's helped create the way that we tell stories in the superhero genre and in comics. And these are some of the examples of Kirby's work. You know, just some of, yeah, we can see some of the structures of these things. So just looking at the screen. I'm not looking down here anyway. But here's some of the structures. He worked on a lot of mediums too. You know, pen and ink, acrylic, and actually created some really pretty wild characters like Omak, the one-man army, and Kamani, the last boy on Earth, and things like the Demon, you know, and all these different types of like really elaborate, you know, mythical worlds. So.
But he structured the way that, like, as John said earlier, he structured the way that we think about comics, that we think about characters, world building, and things as Black creators. But as Black creators, we counter the movement with our own creations. And the way that we do that, it's interesting because it's still built on Kirby's construct. It's still built on his template, even though we're countering it.
Yeah, and so I think what was happening was when we started sitting and thinking about, you know, working together, and this is actually one of the first pieces that we did together. Stacey actually created this this collage for a character that I created called the Dire Collector. It's from one of my stories I'm working on. And so this is actually the first collaborative piece of that we did together, right? And you can see, I actually did like the digital coloring and some of like the digital painting and such. And it's like, oh, that was actually pretty exciting to work like that, you know?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, you know, we don't take advantage of the fact that comics can be really collaborative, right? You know, in mainstream comics, the creation of the stories are done by a writer, an inker, you know, penciler, editor, all these different like people that are doing the story. A lot of times, you know, we're laboring by ourselves, doing the writing and storing everything by ourselves. So I really became like kind of addicted to collaboration since I've been working with my partner Daniel Duffy for like what, 7 years, something like that. But I'm always looking to, you know, to find other ways to you know, to work together. I found that Stacey and I, like you said earlier, we actually had like a lot of things in common as far as like coming from the hip hop generation, actually thinking about like politically where we were. Our styles are, you know, and I want to show you because we're going to look at a stylistic comparison, but our styles are like very different, but also thematically kind of overlap. And so, yeah, and I think after talking about the work, we started really trusting each other's process, you know, how we think about the work. So, you know, the fantastic Blackness piece that happened was a colleague of ours named Dr. Adelaide, who did this book called Super Black, and he also wrote this book called Black Space, that's looking at Black presence in like science fiction and actually in Black superheroes. And he put together this piece called Fantastic Blackness. It's going to be a show of like independent comics, loosely based off of the Black comics book that Dana and I did. And immediately when he said Fantastic Blackness, I was, oh, you're like the Fantastic Four. And so I immediately started to look for the typeface. That actually, this is actually based off of the Fantastic Four logo, you know, and it's a typeface. So actually, like as a designer, I just started working with the logo. And this is around the same time that Stacey was saying earlier that this discrepancy between like the Kirby family was happening with the Disney outfit as far as like getting remuneration for some of like Kirby's you know, creations. And so we were still having these talks about it, and I started doing these posters that were you know, based off of Kirby's images and stuff, right? So this is a character that we ended up calling Major Sankofa, right? And you know, it's obviously based off of one of Jack Kirby's like, you know, classic Captain America poses from Mind Bomb. This is when he first started working for Marvel again, because he actually leaves Marvel like in the I want to say it was like what, the early 70s? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and because he was a DC Comics, gave him kind of free reign to create a whole world of creations there. But that kind of goes sour, and it goes back to Marvel to work, you know, in like the late 70s on a lot of these pieces as well. And so creating a character like Major Sankofa that kind of like echoes physically some of the things that's going on with Captain America, but also having like these different attributes. For instance, the Sankofa idea of like going back and getting history and representing it in the present. I mean, that's kind of what Captain America is, right? He's a living anachronism where he's a man out of time, you know, trying to actually create an America that he actually used to live in, but also having a disconnect or you know, with what's actually happening in the 1960s when he's actually revived, you know, by the Avengers, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of like esoteric like intertextuality going on too, but formally, you know, we try to make like these things like really interesting visually, but then also inundated with a lot of like intertextual, even intergenerational information that's going on in the work. So.
And the comics medium is just perfect for that. Yeah, just fits that format so
right, and also, you know, I said we're both from the like really huge fans of hip hop culture as well, and graffiti. And actually, you know, when I was looking at Stacey's work when we were on the stage at OnyxCon, he showed me a lot of his like graffiti work and some of his tag work, and just like work that's inspired by, you know, graffiti culture. And I was like blown away by it. I was like, I'm like, why don't you show this? He just had it in his portfolio. I was like, this is amazing stuff, you know. So this notion of like working together just became like really apparent, and so we started talking about this issue, and we'll get back to it later. But I'm just showing some comparisons because I love showing like the before and afters. You know, like this is actually Big Barda, which is one of Jack Kirby's characters. She's kind of like almost like a super Wonder Woman character. You know, she's Mr. Miracle's girlfriend, and so you know, Big Barda becomes Big Sister, right? And then Dark Side, which some argue might be an influence for like Darth Vader, becomes Black Hand Side. So, and this is actually just around the same time doing covers for Dr. Jonathan Gales' really awesome documentary about Black masculinity and comics called White Scripts and Black Supermen. Well, we were actually starting to play around with those things as well, right? And you can see it's just rife with the Kirby crackle, you know, and some of the really awkward, you know, foreshortening that Kirby would do, and the way that he actually, like, you know, would kind of hack into the human form and create these things. And actually, a lot of people have seen this, like, I don't know, kind of Earth, Wind, and Fire, like Black Lightning kind of inspired character. But yeah, but basically, like, using it as a tool to kind of start talking about that work. So this is the part where we kind of like talk about some of our influences and sort of what that we're doing now. So.
These are two of my pieces. The one on
It'll be like the audience left for you. I think it's the audience.
Yeah, it looks like I gotta look at it.
I know.
The woman, form of the woman. It's an earlier work I was working on in my final year of undergrad. I'm a non-traditional student, so I just finished undergrad as I was working as a graphic designer, and I was playing with these ideas of abstraction and Afrofuturism and dealing with contemporary art and thinking of the way that I was making art. And the other piece, the John Coltrane piece, is more of a recent piece. I did that about a year ago, I believe. And I was really playing with these ideas of really pushing the abstraction, really pushing collage, playing with more of ideas of not focusing on perfection, but focusing on spontaneity in making art and realizing that art didn't have to be perfect. And so I guess after graduating, somehow I started to think more freely, I guess, about the way I was making art and not being so concerned about what I thought about art or what I believed art was supposed to be, because I was really inspired by Michelangelo, Caravaggio, and some John Byrne. We talked about John Byrne, George Perez, some of those comic artists whose lines are very definitive and very precise. And I had to actually let go of that the more I studied art. And John helped me out a lot with that. So these, my more current work deals a lot more with abstraction, layers. I think there's a piece in here, I'll talk about it when it comes up. I'm trying to think that Mother Bonds.
Oh yes, later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I made a mistake, and somehow I threw away a file that I was working on, and all I had to work on was a file that I'm glad I sent John. It was an unfinished version, but it gave me a new style. In that, the only way I could actually finish the piece was to actually work on a flattened layer of the image that I had. And in doing so, it taught me that I did not have to work within these confines that I had already put on myself. It didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to be, I didn't have to save my steps so that I could go back to it later and then fix it. I actually started to make my work harder to challenge myself. Okay, I'm gonna flatten this, and then I create a problem, so I'm gonna have to solve this problem.
Right.
And in doing so, just really came up with a really new style. It was very freeing, and it relaxed my mind a lot. Allowed me to get a lot of work done, actually.
It's amazing how much intensity you can put into a piece and how much it also simultaneously relaxes you. And this notion of like creating problems. I mean, both Stacey and I are trained as graphic designers, and so graphic designers are, visual problem solvers, who happen to use particular graphic elements to do that problem solving, right? And so Milton Glaser was one of my favorite graphic designers and illustrators used to say that problems are my friends, you know? Because, you know, you have these particular parameters that you have to work inside of, and then you start like building these different notions of how you can negotiate visually these things. And so, you know, I was looking at the fact that Stacey and I became like really interested in these notions of like the post-human, like cybernetic images, speculative spaces where we can create new bodies to exist in as Black people, or being very influenced by like what's been called, you know, Afrofuturism, or the ethno-surreal, or even what I've been kind of dabbling with and recently called the ethnogothic, this notion of like Gothic, you know, speculative spaces where you can create, you know, these new ways of imagining, you know, what we've been calling this product called Blackness, right? And so here we just kind of look at some of the connections between, you know, Stacey and my work. These are from a series of cybernetic images that I did called Matters of the Fact. And so this other piece is from the Master Black series, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Stacey's been working on for his own art book. And as you can see, we're both dealing with these notions of like the cybernetic and the you know, the post-human to a certain degree, but in a very different way, you know, as far as like stylistic rendering, the formal constraints around how we're working. And by the way, both of us work digitally primarily. I mean, we're both trained as like, you know, illustrators and commercial artists, like, and a lot of stuff is like hand done, but also, you know, a lot of it's, you know, in the computer too. People always ask about that too. So. Mm-hmm. But you want to talk about this first?
This is this piece right here called First Contact. This was our first test for Black Kirby. And this was, the pencil lines are from my Master Black collection. And I gave it to him. I actually sent him all my sketches and let him choose, and he and picked and played with these ideas. And from that, it actually started to formulate how we were going to work together for Black Kirby.
Right. I really enjoy it because, I mean, to see like the power of the line that Stacey uses, but it almost is like one line. You know, it almost feels like he doesn't almost like lift his pen sometimes.
Right. And yeah, I do play with those contour lines and making everything connect, and I actually do that. Yeah.
Right. And
it is not all one line. But
right, I know, yeah, but it just feels like it sometimes, especially the way he like kind of drops it down to the signature, you know, that kind of piece. So, you know, it feels really cool. And I don't know, it just felt really natural to start working that way, working with Stacey on these pieces. And again, we started to like really learn how to trust each other, you know, as collaborators, you know. And so anyway, I'm assuming that most of you heard like of the Avengers and the Avengers film and how much money it made. It's like 1.6 billion dollars or something like that worldwide. I mean, yeah, I know, right? That's a lot of simoleons. Yeah, you can talk like this. Like, don't even that sounds like monopoly money. That's simoleons. You know, it's like 10 googillions, right? It's like, you know, that kind of. And so, you know, what happened when we started working together was this lawsuit that went down. I mean, you know, anybody familiar with a work for hire contract? You know, most of the, yeah. So basically, if you're doing like work for hire for someone, you're making the artwork, and then the person that you're working for owns everything that you've done, right? And that's it. You get paid once. That's it. Most of the work in the early days in like making comics was work for hire. One of the reasons why Jack Kirby drew 25,000 pages is because he had a family to feed, and you know, still to this day in the mainstream market, you know, you get paid per page. You know, whatever your page rate is, right? You get paid per page for every, you know, aspect of it too. So if you're doing pencil and inking, you get paid for inking and for penciling per page, that kind of thing. And so, you know, so he didn't own Captain America. He didn't own the rights to the Hulk. He didn't own the rights to the Avengers, right? When did Disney buy Marvel? 2007? Is that right, It was, I don't even, how long is it? But now Disney owns Marvel Comics.
It was around that time.
2010.
How much they paid?
I thought it was earlier than that, but you know, but anyway, so the mouse now owns Marvel Comics, you know, which totally frightens us, you know, when it first happened, because you know the mouse could be really hard to deal with, you know, and so what happened is that they saw that these Marvel Comics movies, because Marvel actually started its own studio, was producing its own films, you know, I think the Iron Man movie like made what, God knows how much, $1 billion or or something like that. It was a huge success, right? So like, oh, we need to acquire that property, and actually start building out these really big franchise movies like the Avengers, right? And so, his estate was like, well, can we get a little bit of that money, maybe? I mean, I know it's work for hire, but, $50,000, I don't know, something. It's not like they're hurting for cash, as far as I understand, but it just, you do see like a lot of people getting rich, from Jack Kirby's work, and this happens a lot in entertainment, not just to like Jewish creators, but, creators in general, right? And so we didn't really think it was right. I mean, we knew it was the law. We know, like, the risk that you're taking, but he's inspired like so many people in popular culture, and he kind of worked tirelessly, virtually invisible, to a lot of people. I mean, some people knew who Jack Kirby was, but most people don't. You know who Stan Lee is. And not to take away from Stan Lee as a writer, as a creator, but we decided that we should really do something about that and start looking at the connections between, like, African American creators and Jewish American creators, looking at these connections between what was going on in the civil rights era, when a lot of these particular comic books were coming into to vogue, like Spider-Man and the X-Men and things of that nature. And people are still making a lot of money off of Jack Kirby's work. Like Tomorrow's Publishing does these books called like Kirby Collector, right, things like that, where they actually, because he's created so much work, he has like magazines just dedicated to his work, And really cool, we actually got featured in one of them as we got, Black Kirby was actually featured in like one of the Kirby collectors recently. And so people like Jim Starlin and what's this guy's name? I forgot his name now. I should have put his name down. That was a mistake. Writer Grant Morrison. Ooh, okay, the ball guy. He's a writer, and really famous writer actually in comics. And it's Jim Starlin, who's an artist and writer from the 1970s. Some of the work that Tom Scioli is doing with like Joe Casey with Godland is directly influenced by Kirby's work. So we were like looking at these instances, and we decided to create Black Kirby as kind of like a way to deal with those interconnections. Right? Actually, this is a piece that Stacey and I did called "Unkillable Buck Returns." Right?
That's the book. I can't wait to.
I know.
Right? We talked about people. Okay, one of the main questions we get after, well, when's the catalog coming out, or where are the prints at?
Yeah, I know.
Right. Which I'm still blaming on you.
No, I'm not blaming.
No.
Once we started doing the work, people actually started wanting to see the work. Because actually, like, this is like the 9th or 10th showing of like the work since October, right? We worked on looking at creating this stuff like over like about a year, and then in about 2.5 month period during the summer, it just came out. And so, every so often, I mean, you would see work that was just like exploding from this team, and we made like maybe 85 pieces of work, in like a 2.5 month period, to just speed out.
But we discussed as we were making these characters, inadvertently we were making a universe. Like we were building our mythos around what was already established, which was really interesting. Like we built upon what was already built upon. And so we started to come up with ideas for the Unkillable Buck stories.
For Shango, for characters like that.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, for Astro Black. And,
right.
Yeah, so we actually started pulling in a lot of things from like Afrofuturism, from jazz, from like hip hop, from all these different pieces, and started building, kind of a nexus of thought around it. It's like, oh, we never really thought about creating stories, but we're thinking about the show and actually like riffing on a lot of these things through these different lenses, So for instance, like Black Panther with this Huey T'Challa piece that Stacey did was like, okay, so let's just make it like that. So like maybe that is, why the Black Panthers call themselves, that kind of thing. It is actually some other people's influences too. This is, oh my God, Dewalo, Jabari Anderson, right? So it's like we were influenced by a lot of this work, playing around with, and people, I forgot his children's name, Sutton, what's Sutton's first name? I should put names on stuff, But using the space, as Stacey said, as like a way to talk about these political issues, This is my favorite, Metamorpho. The Teen Titans. I'm sorry, it's hilarious. This is the pieces that Stacey was talking about, this notion of like an entity that is a female entity that's connected to the universe. So So, you know, the mother box in Jack Kirby's Fourth World series was like, it was kind of like a supernatural, funky like iPhone. You know, it connected you to everything. It was connected to what he called the source, which knitted the world together. Kind of like the Force. It sounds familiar, right? And so, it took this form of like this sublime technology. And so, we started thinking about this idea of like, you know, really like Afrofuturist kind of looks at everything kind of like a technology, and everything can be hacked into. That includes like race, religion, space, time. Everything can be hacked into, and that's actually something that African Americans as creators have always tried to do, is like hack directly into the things that were kind of like the technologies that were controlling us, you know, or to have access to that technology, right? Whether it be like literacy of some kind, you know, whether it be like access to the internet, whether it be a library card, you know, just trying to like get access so we can actually change the way we're like, you know, moving through the world. So, and it's something like Kirby Tech. I think this is like just examples of the stuff that he would do. This is pretty wild. I would be pissed off if I was the inker for this stuff. To go behind and actually try to like draw. It's like, I hate you, Kirby. This is some of like I'm just showing like some of the connections between like some of the pieces that we did. You know, this is like African Robotic. What's the name of it? All Father Odin Bambada. Yeah. So basically, like using, you know, remixing these notions of like how this stuff is working.
Right. We thought about how we thought about sampling and remixing and how it's used in hip hop and how it's connected generations through you know, jazz, for example. I think my appreciation from jazz comes from not just the fact that my mom played it in the house, but the fact that in the late 80s, early 90s, it influenced hip hop so much. So I would actually go back before beat hunting things were so fashionable. I would go and find the original samples, you know, because I was like, oh, that's so dope. Let me go find it. So that's when I got up on John Coltrane and so many others, you know. So we approached the work the same way. Arguably, you know, people talk about sampling and stealing, but we do it in art all the time. Right. If you're familiar with Robert Rauschenberg, I mean,
or Andy Warhol, or
exactly, Andy Warhol,
Picasso.
Right, Picasso, yeah, exactly. So sampling and remixing in art, it's always been done. And we do that even as just being inspired. I think there is no artist who I have no influences. Everybody's inspired by somebody, and we all bite. We all have copied, and that's how you develop your own style. So this idea of sampling and remixing, we actually brought that into the visual realm, into our work, intentionally, to let you know that yes, these are some of Jack Kirby's images that we are taking, we're splicing, and we're adding it to ours, and we're once again sampling and remixing. Right,
and again, if we look at some of the stuff we're doing with that particular impetus as like a jumping off point too. I also do like a lot of work on like, you know, the visual culture of hip hop. I teach a class about, you know, this notion of like how images are like, you know, reinterpreted or, you know, post-produced through, you know, hip hop culture as a lens for like making work. And I teach this class called the visual culture of hip hop. You know, and I call myself a CJ actually. And I actively like keep, you know, textures and things that I keep on a CD, and I actually like that I made like years ago that I actually like sample, remix. Some people might call it like collage. Some people might call it bricolage. You know, if you're like into like, you know, sociology or, you know, or anthropology. You know, but because we're looking at it through a hip hop lens, it's sampling and remixing, or post-production too. I mean, if we borrow, you know, from John Beauregard, some of my favorite pieces. This piece actually is in the show. Before it came to Atlanta, it was at Virginia State University. And we broke this piece up into like comic book bags, because part of the idea of the show was to kind of like critique you know, comics as a consumptive, you know, force, and how it relates, you know, to different notions of consumption and identity. And so basically taking like some of the ways that comics are shown and collected and making it part of the aesthetic. And the digital is actually part of the aesthetic too. And in February alone, we showed it in 5 different spots. You know, one of them was digital, thanks to Jonathan Gales actually. Because of the notion of like the digital, it almost like it infects and hacks into different spaces. And it changes according to what space is available, right? So the next thing we want to do is actually go micro. So we'll put the entire show on the backs of postcards and mail them out to people, or like on the backs of like trading cards, and send you the entire show just in a stack of cards, you know. So basically, really, you know, playing around with this notion of what is the original, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And what can be consumed and what cannot be, what can be owned and what cannot be owned, what could be framed,
Right.
Or should it be framed?
Right.
And so,
Yeah, because you know we wanted to go against that idea. Like for instance, with the show that's up right now at the Southwest Arts Center, it's pinned up. You know, like it just came off the press and it was like tear sheets or something, right? And so the notion of that is that you can actually unpin it, roll it up, and bring it, take it anywhere. It's a very, very beautiful show. When we first showed it in Jackson State, 95% of the show went with me in my suitcase and then up under my arm, right? So it's like a pop-up show. It could be anywhere, and we can like put it up in any space. And so again, it's not really dealing with this notion of like the artist's hand on the print, but because when you collect the comic books, you're collecting the book, you're collecting the final piece. I mean, some people buy the artwork, but you really are buying an incomplete story, right? You know, people collect the comic books. They'll buy one to read sometimes, and they'll bag the other. So we actually use the bag as a hanging system, but also kind of like talking about these notions of preciousness and also consumption, right? And this is some process stuff, you know. So as far as like the future and what end up, so we can actually talk, so you guys can ask us questions, right? Is that what we're gonna do? We just did some work with Copperwire. I don't know if you're familiar with Copperwire, but they did some really interesting things as far as like their remixing of their album Earthbound. So Starbound was a piece where they actually used like the sounds from Stars and remix sounds from Stars, and actually have like a augmented reality video game on the back of their CD, and they actually got this really cool Kickstarter to fund it. It's like mind blowing, you know. And they actually have this thing called, they have a song called Phone Home where you can actually like enter your cell phone number, and it actually remixes the song according to your number. You know, that's like mind blowing. You know, so we actually did some poetry work for them. We're working with Kevin Grevious on a piece. I don't know if Kevin Grevious is one of the co-creators of the Underworld series, and so he's also a comic book writer and writes cartoons and is an actor. You probably recognize him as Ray's from the series, but a lot of people don't realize that he's actually a microbiologist at one particular point, and I think stopped being that and said, I want to be an actor. And you probably remember the Remember the Time video too. He's actually one of the guards. Yeah. So you see him in the background, a lot of stuff. But now, you know, he's a producer, director guy. So this is my boy Singer Phillips from the Prime Meridian. So we're doing some work with another, and this is actually old talk, obviously. We're working with Future Perfect. Stacey's been doing as Black Kirby, or as a faction of Black Kirby, remixing and creating work for an EP for Future Perfect, which is a gentleman out of I forgot what his real name is. What's Future Perfect's real name? I forget. Future Perfect. Anyway, so he's doing these really Afrofuturistic pieces, and you know, so we're collaborating on pieces for that too. Of course, the aforementioned catalog, which is so late. Sorry, I got to finish the catalog. But people have actually written about the work. We've actually like presented we actually did a conference presentation here at Emory for the Alien Bodies Conference that I think went pretty well. And it's been, you know, we actually did a piece, a whole session at the Ohio State University Hip Hop Literacies Conference too. That was really exciting. So we're gonna do T-shirts, posters, all this kind of stuff. And I'm gonna stop talking so we can have some questions. You know, that's Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby.
Yeah, so,
big black fist.
I know, right?
Okay.
So anyway, that's enough said. Yeah. Thank you for listening to us ramble on about the work. So.
Produces the book, markets the book, and distributes the book.
Big City Comics.
The real first black comic
Big
book.
City Comics.
Consciousness versus apathy.
Big City Comics.
Truth and justice.